Hello everyone and welcome to WrestlrMania, and we are at the very beginning of Bret the Hitman Hart. I'm your host John Scott, joined as always by my co-host Matt Essex. And Matt, we're here for arguably, I know personally to us, our most favourite wrestler, I'm guessing, and probably one of the big reasons that we are still today big wrestling fans. And I would go as far as to say the style of wrestling that we like probably transcends from watching Bret Hart through, all those years growing up as a kid. And here we are, Matt. This is going to be the timeline of timelines. I feel like this is the one where we really are going to see a rise of a true hero, a true champion. He's always claimed to be a true world's champion because he defended that title all around the world. But I think this is going to be a unique timeline. I'm going to put it out there as well, folks, that for all the timelines you've enjoyed so far, which have included the likes of Ken Shamrock, Lex Luger, Big Daddy Cool Diesel, with all that knowledge, and we've got some great feedback on our emails about all these the whole facts that we have and the things about money and all the rest of it, like just kind of things that people have never really heard about, and which is really good, because the one thing myself and Matt didn't want to do when we kind of come up with doing this is we didn't want to kind of just be too repetitive to what was already being done elsewhere, especially by the WWE. So, Matt, for this one, obviously this is Bret the Hitman Hart, and coming into this. But I suppose I better put it out there, Matt. For this is going to be the first chapter in this timeline. But Bret Hart, for you, just as an outlook before we even start into this venture, Matt. I'm guessing Bret made quite a big impact. What was the first memories that you had of Bret Hart, and one of the reasons that he sort of become one of your most favourite?
Well, when I first started getting into wrestling, it was around the Attitude Era.
Sure.
And it was kind of that time when he was just getting ready to leave WWE.
Mm-hmm.
But seeing him then, I really liked his style, and that made me want to go back and look more into this guy. And like back then, there was like tons of VHS tapes, and me and my best friend that back then had access to like a huge library of tapes, because he had like every kind of pay-per-view categorized. And then I was just like, well, yes, watch all these in your houses. And as I was going through them, I saw this guy, and he just had that magnetism about wrestling. And just even to this day, when I hear the word technical wrestler, my number one, I just straight away imagine Bret Hart, because that is what I find synonymous with technical wrestling.
Sure, yeah, I'm and for me, Bret Hart, obviously there was, I was a huge Bret fan, but I think I remember becoming very divided, because Wembley Stadium, 92, I went, and of course, on one hand, I was cheering for Bret, who was my favourite at the time, but on the other hand, I had kind of, Britain's own Davey Boy Smith, covered in the Union Jack, and I had a real kind of hard time as a kid trying to put this into some sort of who do I cheer for. But I do remember one thing about that match, that the audience, the crowd, and I know I was quite young at the time, but one thing that stuck in my mind all these years later is that it was very much everyone cheered for kind of both guys. Although Bulldog was the home guy, Bret, very much in the UK, was always pretty much a fan favourite regardless. He seemed to get over very, very well with that international audience. And I know we're going to dive into a lot of these things as we go along. And like you say, yeah, I'm going to put it out there as well. I know that people, when you make this claim about, well, Bret kind of cemented the way to have the smaller guys coming through the WWF chain, people Nowadays they say, well, hang on a minute, what about Randy Savage? Randy Savage was a main event guy. He was there before Bret. He was up against Hogan. People forget about how, that Randy Savage really wasn't a tall guy back then. And you know what? I'm going to say this much about it. And I think Randy Savage, without a doubt, is an incredible wrestler. And don't get me wrong, he was... I would say Randy Savage was one of the first guys, without a doubt, that came up and emerged in the WWF as a guy that size, without being, the King Kong Bundy or, the height of Andre the Giant and all the rest of it. But the one thing, as good as Randy Savage was, especially in matches with Ricky Steamboat, like absolutely incredible matches, the one thing I'll say is that when Randy Savage got to the main event level, if you watch his matches up against Hogan and you watch his main event matches, that style, he had to almost change his style. And I think the one thing that Bret brought to us was the wrestling. I felt like the wrestling become at the forefront. It was more scientific, it was more chemistry to it, and I felt that's like something that Randy Savage wasn't able to do. And it's probably nothing on Randy, but at that time Randy had to kind of fit in with all these giant wrestlers and do their style, whereas Bret kind of came along and he like Shawn Michaels in many ways could make a stick look good. And that kind of wrestling came at the forefront, and it was all about what goes on bell to bell rather than anything else. So that's how I've always looked at it. For me, now on this timeline, we're also going to be using the Bret the Hitman Hart autobiography. Which, by the way, guys, if you're a Bret Hart fan, you cannot go without this. This is an incredible book, and I'm not just trying to plug something here for the sake of the fact that we're doing Bret Hart, but I mean the amount of content in this, the amount of stuff he goes into, especially growing up around the Hart household, it's just some fascinating stories and truly amazing stuff, especially about the Stampede days. But for the sake of this timeline, we are going to start. We're going to start in 1991, and we're going to start just after the time of WrestleMania 7, and it's basically where Bret becomes a solo wrestler. And I did want to spend some time just talking about the Hart Foundation, obviously from where they come out of. But Matt, it's fair to say the Hart Foundation was definitely one of the best tag teams that WWF had at the time. But they was in amongst some really good tag teams. Like it's not like today where we think of tag teams, you get about one or two teams that you'd say are off the chain. Back then you had a real roster of tag teams, like really good solid teams that were around, and you had to be pretty decent to get ahead back then. How much do you rate the Hart Foundation in terms of the whole tag team scene that was going on back then?
Oh yeah, I mean, I used to love the Hart Foundation. It's like one of those teams where the combination is just perfect. Mm-hmm. You get like Anvil as the real powerhouse, and a tough guy, and then you get like Bret, who is the real technical person that can dissect someone and just like the scalpel the team and just like take people apart. But then, like you said, this was a time when, today the tag team scene is a bit dead. You get like one team that's on the top and seems to dominate a division, and then they take it in turns. But at this time, it was hella competitive, and just the fact that they could shine in that kind of dimension was like amazing at the time. And when you have people like putting on the main events, you've got people like your Hulk Hogan's back then, who, although they had like tremendous amounts of charisma and like the ability to draw a crowd, like people like Bret Hart and Anvil were doing all the heavy lifting and hard work for the night, putting on the show. And like after the night was said and done, although they saw the main event with Hogan in it, I bet you a lot of people would go home and talk about just how good those matches were that Anvil and Bret Hart were putting on. Yeah,
absolutely. That's a great point. And I would definitely say that was a true fact to what was going on back then, undoubtedly. a true fact to what was going on back then. And yeah, you're definitely right. So let's just give some facts, some brief stuff here about the background as well from Bret growing up. Obviously, Bret was the 8th child of the wrestling patriarch known, of course, as the one and only Stu Hart. I know we're going to be talking about him through this timeline, Matt, with all the stuff that he got up to, because he was always a familiar face around the WWF scene when Bret was around. But obviously, Bret was born in Calgary, Alberta, and of course, the whole Hart family, the sort of, I guess they're kind of like a royal family almost, Matt, of wrestling, in terms of, you think about the whole, especially now, the generations that have gone down from this, and just, the whole dungeon and the amount of guys that come out of there, and Stampede Wrestling, that style, that quick style, definitely holds up even today, Matt. Like, you still, you always used to, if a guy went through the dungeon, they always had that extra respect, didn't they? Like, if you heard that on TV, you thought, hang on, this guy's got to be tough because he's been trained by Stu Hart.
Oh yeah, definitely. And a lot of this stuff, like, for me, harks back to that VH tape like that I saw.
Yeah.
That was Wrestling with Shadows, wasn't it?
Yes.
And then
yes.
you hear Bret in his own words talk about the dungeon.
Sure.
Just,
yeah.
How hard it was for him as a family member.
Mm-hmm.
That you get no leeway, and
yeah.
you do get stretched. You go to school and you got black eyes, you got bloodshot eyes, just because of how brutal it was that even your own family weren't going to take it easy on you. You have to actually prove that you could hang in that dungeon. Sure,
yeah, no doubt about it. Well, guys, I'm going to get straight into this, and we're going to hit up on April 1991. I'm not sure how far we've gone back in before, but this might be one of our earliest times, I may say, I believe, Matt, but, we'll certainly have to go back on that. But yeah, the Hart Foundation had been together since 1985 in the WWF, had gone on until 91. So they had that's a huge, I know it doesn't seem like a long time, but it is a long time, Matt, when you think about pairing people up. Like today, yeah, you get the occasional team that haven't moved, but it's very seldom that, because the thing is, it's one thing to be a tag team for that long, but how many teams for that long have been current, have been, having good matches all the time, have been doing good matches? Or how many times do we sort of think now, well, yeah, team maybe has about a good year or 2 years, then you don't hear about them so much. Like, they're around, but they don't get involved in anything amazing. I feel like with the Hart Foundation and most of those teams back then, that they were pretty current with whatever they were doing, and that, they always had some good feuds going on in that time. It's kind of odd to think about how long they were together, and before finally, they thought about pairing these two guys off, and obviously Bret going solo. It's kind of, I guess, what Vince had in his mind. But Matt, for you, that tag team ending right there, I mean, is there any matches that you, that you remember being good for the Hart Foundation? I mean, I certainly would say to anybody, suggest watching the matches with the Bulldogs. I think most of those matches were excellent, against Dynamite and Davey. Some great matches. But also, they did have some good kind of house show matches with the Rockers. I'm not talking about the one where the rope broke, by the way, in the main events one. But they had some great matches, like against I'm trying to think of, was it the Ruzio brothers as well? Really good matches with those. Any stand out for you, Matt?
Oh, so many. And just like you said, the Bulldogs and that was amazing stuff, the work they would do back then. But even things when you just talk about them and they spring to my mind, it's like I just remember the most random things, like a Battle Royal where that Andre the Giant was the main focus, but somehow it comes down to Bret Hart and Anvil being the last two in the ring with him, and even try as they might, it's this incredibly difficult task to get Andre out, and in the end they both succumb to him. But yeah, other stuff as well, like when you think about Jimmy Hart and how he used to manage them, and just how well that dynamic went down as well. And then when he switches and he goes to the Nasty Boys, and you get all that.
Yeah.
so many great memories of this team. Just like you don't get any of that stuff anymore these days.
Sure. Well, I'm going to hit us up straight away from the Bret book, and I'm going to read a small part out of this. And this is basically, and I suppose you forget about this because when he was in the Hart Foundation, the one thing he wasn't